In July 2025, headlines around the world declared it had finally happened. The red heifer, the ancient biblical requirement for temple purification, sacrificed in Israel. Prophecy channels exploded overnight. Millions shared the news. Television networks picked it up. There was just one problem. The very organization leading Third Temple preparations released an official statement. The animal used was, in their own words, the most invalid of their candidates. It had a physical defect. The ceremony was a controlled simulation. So the story the world thought it witnessed never actually happened. But here is what did happen. Over 60 sacred vessels are sitting in Jerusalem right now. Trained priests are rehearsing ancient rituals. Architectural blueprints are complete and awaiting a single government permit. And the political ground around the Temple Mount shifted in ways that nobody predicted. The preparations are real. The timeline just got complicated. And the full story is nothing like what you have heard. A few steps from the Western Wall in Jerusalem's Old City sits a building most tourists walk right past. No grand entrance, no dramatic signage, but inside, something has been quietly taking shape for nearly 4 decades. It is called the Temple Institute, founded in 1987, and its mission has never changed. Rebuild the Holy Temple on Mount Moriah, not symbolically, not spiritually, literally. For most of its early years, the world dismissed it. A fringe group, critics said, religious dreamers with no real plan. But then something shifted, because while the world was not paying attention, the Temple Institute was not dreaming. They were building. Piece by piece, vessel by vessel, they went back to the Torah and ancient rabbinical sources and began recreating every single item required for temple worship. Not replicas for display, working instruments for actual service. Start with the menorah, 7-branched, hammered from a single piece of pure gold, weighing 95 pounds, valued at $2 million. It is finished. It is sitting in Jerusalem right now. Then there is the incense altar, overlaid in gold, built to the exact dimensions described in the book of Exodus. The showbread table, the copper basin used for priestly washing, the silver trumpets once sounded by the sons of Aaron, all of them recreated, all of them verified by leading rabbinical scholars. Over 60 sacred vessels in total, complete and waiting. But the vessels are only part of it. The Temple Institute also restored the musical instruments of ancient temple worship. Harps, lyres, cymbals, each one built to match biblical specifications. They recreated the anointing oil, a specific formula from Exodus chapter 30, using rare spices including myrrh and cassia, an oil that had not been produced in over 2,000 years until now. And then there are the garments. The high priest's ephod, woven with gold thread in blue, purple, and scarlet. The breastplate set with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The linen tunics, the sashes, the headpieces. Every item approved by top rabbinical authorities. Every item ready to be worn. Now here is where the story moves from history into the present. In 2025, the Temple Institute opened a new visitors center in Jerusalem. Inside it sits an architectural model of the Third Temple, built at a scale of 1 to 50, precise enough to serve as a construction reference. And the blueprints behind that model are not theoretical. According to reports, construction plans are complete and currently await a building permit from the Jerusalem municipality. Infrastructure planning, including roads, tram lines, and utility access, is already being discussed by city authorities. Read that again. The plans are done. The permit is the only remaining administrative step. So everything is in place. The vessels, the garments, the oil, the instruments, the architectural plans. Everything except one thing. And that one missing piece caused one of the biggest stories of 2025 to completely fall apart. What was it? And what actually happened when the world thought the final requirement had been met? To understand why 2025 mattered so much, you need to understand one ancient requirement, one that has stopped every serious conversation about the Third Temple for 2,000 years. It is found in the book of Numbers, chapter 19, and it involves a cow. Not just any cow. According to biblical law, before the temple can operate, before priests can perform sacred duties, Before anyone can enter the holiest space on earth, a specific purification ceremony must take place. It requires a red heifer, entirely red, not a single hair of another color, no blemish anywhere on its body, and it must never have been put to work. If even one white or black hair is found, it is disqualified. The ashes of this animal, mixed with water from a natural spring, form the only substance capable of ritual purification under Mosaic law. Without it, temple service cannot begin, and for over 2,000 years, no qualified candidate had been found in the land of Israel, until a group of ranchers in Texas thought they might have the answer. Several years ago, the Temple Institute partnered with cattle breeders in Texas to raise red heifers specifically meeting biblical requirements. 5 animals were eventually selected and transported to Israel. The news traveled fast. Prophecy communities around the world took notice. Some called it a sign, others called it the final missing piece. But then came the waiting, because a red heifer must be at least 2 years old before the ceremony can take place, and during that time, it must remain unblemished. Shedding one by one, the Texas heifers began developing disqualifying characteristics. White hairs appeared. Physical changes disqualified others. By 2024, the list had shortened significantly. And then came July 2025. Reports began circulating that a red heifer ceremony had taken place near the Mount of Olives. Within hours, it was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Social media flooded with reactions. Millions of people believed they had just witnessed the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old biblical requirement. Some said the end times clock had officially started, but something did not add up. In November 2025, the Temple Institute and the reconstituted Sanhedrin released official statements. What they said stopped many people in their tracks. According to their own account, the animal used in the July ceremony had a physical defect, a damaged tail, and it was described, in their own language, as the most invalid of their current candidates. The priestly garments worn during the event had not been formally consecrated. The ceremony was not the fulfillment. It was a controlled simulation, conducted specifically to identify weak points in the process and improve readiness for when a qualified animal is found. Rabbi Azariah Ariel, who leads the Temple Institute's Red Heifer Project, was direct. He stated that at that moment, it was unclear whether Israel even possessed a heifer that fully met biblical standards. All 5 Texas heifers had been disqualified. A new breeding program would need to start from the beginning. Now here is where most coverage of this story stopped. But the Temple Institute did not stop there. In the same period, they released a clarification that reframed the entire conversation. The red heifer, they stated, is not required before temple construction can begin. They pointed to historical precedent. The second temple was built while the entire nation of Israel was in a state of ritual impurity. Construction proceeded, worship was restored. The purification requirement was addressed in stages, which means the absence of a qualified red heifer does not halt the rebuilding process. It only affects who can perform certain rituals once the temple is standing. So where does that leave everything? The most widely reported prophetic event of 2025 turned out to be a rehearsal, not a fulfillment. The search for a qualified red heifer continues, but the temple itself is not waiting on that search to move forward, and the people who would serve inside it have been preparing for years. What those preparations actually look like on the ground will change how you see this entire story. The vessels are made, the blueprints are filed, the red heifer search continues. But none of it matters without the people trained to actually use it. Because the temple is not just a building. It is a system of worship, and that system requires a specific group of people to operate it. Not volunteers, not clergy from a seminary, priests, descendants of Aaron, men from a specific bloodline stretching back over 3,000 years. And here is what almost nobody is talking about. Those men exist, they have been identified, and they are training right now. For centuries, Jewish families preserved careful genealogical records, even through exile, even through dispersion across dozens of countries. The priestly line, known as the Kohanim, was never entirely lost, and in recent decades, something remarkable confirmed what those records claimed. DNA studies identified a specific genetic marker shared by men across vastly different Jewish communities, communities that had no contact with each other for generations, men from Europe, men from the Middle East, men from Africa and Asia, all carrying the same marker, all tracing back to a single ancestral priestly line. More than 300 of these men have now been identified and have begun active preparation for temple service. This is not a classroom exercise. These men are learning the morning and evening offering rituals in precise sequence. They are studying the biblical laws of purity that govern every movement inside the temple. They are trained in the handling of sacred vessels, the choreography of worship, and the exact positioning required at each stage of service. Replica altars have been constructed outside Jerusalem. Practice ceremonies have been conducted using goats and lambs, not as symbols, as halakhically correct rehearsals for actual temple sacrifice. Every footstep, every gesture, every transfer of a vessel from one hand to another, all of it rehearsed to exact biblical specification. And overseeing all of it is a body that most people assumed was gone forever. The Sanhedrin, the council of 71 Torah scholars that governed religious life during the Second Temple period, was formally reconstituted in 2005. It meets regularly. It issues legal decisions. It is actively addressing the legal and ceremonial questions that temple restoration would require. Questions like, can the temple be built before the arrival of the Messiah? How does temple law interact with modern Israeli civil law? What constitutes valid priestly qualification in the 21st century? These are not theoretical discussions. They are working through answers. In 2016, the Sanhedrin took a step that signaled just how seriously this preparation is being taken. They appointed a potential high priest, Rabbi Baruch Kahane. He has worn the full garments of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, in formal ceremonial training events. He has presided over rehearsals of the Yom Kippur service, the most sacred ritual in the temple calendar. A man exists, trained and designated, ready to serve as high priest the moment the temple stands. Priests trained, Sanhedrin functioning, high priest designated. The human infrastructure for temple worship is in place, but the Temple Mount itself sits at the center of one of the most complex political situations on earth. And in 2025, that situation changed in ways that few people anticipated. What happened in Washington has direct implications for what happens in Jerusalem, and the names involved will surprise you. There is a vision in the book of Ezekiel that has puzzled scholars for centuries. God tells the prophet to take 2 sticks, one labeled for Judah, one for Joseph, and then to join them together in his hand. The meaning follows immediately. God declares he will gather his people from every nation where they have been scattered, bring them back to their own land, and make them one nation again. For most of history, that passage felt like a distant promise. The tribes were gone, scattered across continents, absorbed into other cultures. Their identities faded over generations. But something has been quietly happening over the past several decades, and it is difficult to explain without taking that passage seriously. Start in northeastern India. There, in the remote hill regions of Manipur and Mizoram, lives a community called the Bnei Menashe. They claim descent from Manasseh, one of the 10 lost tribes of Israel exiled by the Assyrian Empire over 2,700 years ago. For generations, they preserved practices that had no connection to the surrounding culture. Sabbath observance, dietary laws, circumcision, ancient prayers with traces of Hebrew structure. When Jewish scholars first encountered this community, many were skeptical, but the consistency of their traditions across isolated villages was difficult to dismiss. Today, over 5,000 Bnei Menashe have made Aliyah, the formal immigration process to Israel under Jewish law. Thousands more are in the process of completing their return. Then there is the Beta Israel community of Ethiopia, Ethiopian Jews who lived in near-complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world for centuries. No contact with rabbinical traditions that developed in Europe and the Middle East, no access to the Talmud as it evolved over generations. Yet when scholars examined their faith, they found a form of Judaism that closely mirrored the laws of Moses. Sabbath, kosher dietary practices, biblical festivals, preserved with remarkable accuracy across centuries of isolation. Today, approximately 150,000 Ethiopian Jews live in Israel. Many were brought over in dramatic government operations. Operation Moses in 1984, Operation Solomon in 1991. Entire communities airlifted to the land their ancestors had spoken of for generations. And then there is a story from southern Africa that stopped genetic researchers in their tracks. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa had long maintained an oral tradition of descent from ancient Israelites. Few outside their community took the claim seriously until DNA studies were conducted. The results showed that a significant portion of Lemba men carry a specific genetic marker associated with the ancient priestly line of Aaron, the same marker found in Jewish communities across the world. Their oral traditions also preserved practices consistent with Mosaic law: circumcision, dietary restrictions, a day of rest, avoidance of certain foods and objects, a lineage maintained not through documents, but through generations of oral memory and lived practice. And beyond these specific communities, the broader return has been accelerating. Since Israel was established in 1948, over 3.5 million Jewish people have immigrated from across the world, from Russia, from France, from the United States, from South America. And in the years following 2020, a new wave began. Jews from Western nations returning at a pace not seen in decades, not because of crisis alone, but because of something harder to quantify: a pull toward home. Ezekiel described two sticks becoming one nation, gathered from every side, brought back to their own land. The communities returning today span India, Ethiopia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Whether one reads this through a prophetic lens or a historical one, the movement is real and it is documented. But the return of the people is only one dimension of this story. Because while the tribes have been coming home, something else has been happening in the halls of political power. Something that connects Washington, D.C. directly to the Temple Mount, and the person at the center of that connection now holds one of the most powerful positions in the United States government. Everything covered so far has lived largely within religious and academic circles: the Temple Institute, the priestly training, the returning communities, important, documented, but mostly below the radar of mainstream political attention. That changed in 2025, because the conversation about the Temple Mount stopped being purely religious and started showing up in places it had never appeared before. Washington, D.C., the U.S. Congress, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Start with a moment that happened years before it became significant. In 2019, a television personality and political commentator named Pete Hegseth traveled to Jerusalem. He walked the Temple Mount, and he did not go alone. He went with Rabbi Chaim Richman, the international director of the Temple Institute, the very organization that has spent decades preparing the vessels, the garments, and the blueprints for the Third Temple. At the time, it was noted in religious media circles and largely ignored everywhere else. But in January 2025, Pete Hegseth was confirmed as the United States Secretary of Defense, one of the most powerful military and geopolitical positions on Earth. Chiku, a man who had walked the Temple Mount alongside the Temple Institute's own leadership, now sat at the head of the Pentagon. Whether that connection carries future policy weight remains to be seen. But the proximity is difficult to ignore. Around the same time, something was moving through the United States Congress. A House resolution was introduced in the 119th Congress, which convened in January 2025. The resolution addressed religious access to the Temple Mount directly. It noted a documented inequality in how the site is administered. According to the resolution, Muslim worshippers can access the Temple Mount through 11 different entry points. Non-Muslim visitors, including Jewish worshippers, are restricted to a single gate. Furthermore, Jewish visitors are denied access entirely on Fridays and Saturdays, the Jewish Sabbath. The resolution affirmed Israeli sovereignty over the Temple Mount and called for equal religious access to the site. It did not pass into law, but its introduction marked something significant. The Temple Mount, For decades, a topic carefully avoided in formal U.S. legislative language had entered the congressional record as a matter of religious rights and national sovereignty. Then came October 2025. A reporter at a White House press briefing asked Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt a direct question. Had the topic of rebuilding the Third Temple ever come up in discussions with President Trump? Her answer was brief, firm, and immediate. It has not. One sentence, no elaboration. But the fact that a mainstream journalist asked that question in a formal White House briefing tells its own story. The idea had moved far enough into public consciousness that it required an official response. Separately, reporting emerged about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. According to those reports, Netanyahu privately expressed to a religious leader that he believes he has been called to play a role in the restoration of the temple. The exact nature and full context of that statement has not been independently verified by major news organizations. It is worth noting as reported information while recognizing it remains unconfirmed at the highest levels of verification. But within Israeli religious and political circles, the report generated significant discussion. And then, there is the broader regional picture. As part of ongoing Middle East normalization efforts connected to the Abraham Accords framework, reports emerged of preliminary discussions about a possible multinational religious administration over the Temple Mount. Under this proposed framework, representatives from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Indonesia, and potentially Israel would share administrative oversight of the site. No formal agreement has been announced. But the fact that such a framework is reportedly being discussed represents a shift in how the Temple Mount is being approached at the diplomatic level. A site that was once considered permanently off the table for renegotiation is now reportedly part of active regional conversations. So step back and look at what 2025 actually produced. A Temple Mount advocate confirmed as U.S. Secretary of Defense. A congressional resolution addressing Temple Mount access entering the legislative record. A direct White House question about the Third Temple requiring an official answer. Unverified but widely reported statements from Israel's Prime Minister about a personal sense of historic calling. And quiet diplomatic conversations about reshaping who controls the most contested religious site on earth. None of these things individually rebuilds the temple, but each one represents a door that was previously closed, and doors that were closed are now open. Which raises the question that Scripture has been pointing toward for centuries. What does the Bible say actually happens once the temple is standing, and how much of it has already begun? Everything covered so far has been documented, verifiable, sourced, real, the vessels, the priests, the returning communities, the political shifts. But there is a layer underneath all of it that gives every single piece its weight, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. There is a very old book that described all of it, and it did not describe it after the fact. Start with a moment most people know, but few have examined closely. In 1948, Israel became a nation again. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, a people without a homeland voted themselves back into existence, and the world recognized it. The prophet Isaiah asked a question centuries before that moment. Can a nation be born in a single day? On May 14, 1948, that question received its answer. That event alone would be remarkable, but it was only the beginning. 19 years later, in June 1967, Israeli forces took control of Jerusalem during a conflict that lasted 6 days. For the first time since the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, Jewish people had sovereignty over their ancient capital. The prophet Zechariah had written about Jerusalem becoming a source of tension for the surrounding nations, a burden, a point of conflict that would draw the attention of the entire world. Look at any newspaper from the past 50 years. Jerusalem has rarely left the front page. Now, the temple. The prophet Daniel wrote about a future period involving a covenant, a restoration of temple sacrifices, and then a dramatic interruption of those sacrifices at the midpoint of a 7-year period. Daniel described something being set up in the temple that would be deeply offensive, a desecration, an abomination in the holiest place on earth. Centuries later, Jesus referenced Daniel's prophecy directly. He told his disciples to watch for it, to understand it as a sign of the end of the age. And the Apostle Paul, writing to believers in Thessalonica, described a future figure who would enter the temple of God and declare himself to be God. Not a metaphor, not symbolic language, a physical location, a physical act, a physical person. For that to happen, a physical temple must exist. The book of Revelation adds another layer. The Apostle John describes being told to measure the temple in Jerusalem, but he is instructed to leave out the outer court, because it has been given over to the nations. Many scholars read this as a description of a divided Temple Mount, a future arrangement where the temple exists alongside other structures, where different groups share the same sacred ground under some form of negotiated arrangement. Consider what was covered earlier in this video. Preliminary discussions about a multinational religious administration over the Temple Mount. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Indonesia, Israel, a shared oversight structure for the most contested site on earth. Whether those discussions produce an agreement or not, the framework being described matches the picture in Revelation with a closeness that is worth sitting with. Then there is Ezekiel. Chapters 40 through 48 describe a future temple in extraordinary architectural detail. Dimensions, courtyards, gates, chambers. The level of specificity is not poetic. It reads like a blueprint, and at the center of that vision is a promise. The glory of God returning to fill the temple, worship restored, the presence of God dwelling again among his people. Jewish tradition, Christian theology, and even some Islamic scholarship all recognize the significance of a restored temple in the final chapters of human history. They disagree on what it means. They disagree on the timeline. But the temple itself sits at the center of all three. Now pull everything together. Israel reborn in 1948. Jerusalem recaptured in 1967. The Temple Institute founded in 1987. Sacred vessels completed over the following decades. Priestly training underway. Lost communities returning, political ground shifting. Each of these events was considered impossible before it happened. Each one was written about in ancient texts long before it occurred. And each one moved the story one chapter closer to where those texts say it is going. The Bible does not present the rebuilding of the temple as the end of the story. It presents it as the beginning of the final chapter, a chapter that includes both darkness and resolution. Both crisis and the arrival of something long promised. For those who read these texts as prophecy, the preparations described in this video are not exciting news. They are sobering news, because the same scriptures that predicted Israel's return also describe what follows the temple's restoration. And those events are not small. So here is where everything lands. The preparations are real, the timeline is moving, the political ground is shifting. The ancient texts are specific, and yet one question remains. The biggest one, the one that has been underneath this entire story from the very first second. Is this generation the one that sees it happen? And if it is, are you ready for what the answer actually means? There is a pattern running through everything in this story, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every single development described in this video was considered impossible before it happened. Not unlikely, not difficult. Impossible. In 1900, the idea of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East was a dream held by a small group of activists that most of the world dismissed entirely. 48 years later, it was a nation recognized by the international community. In 1966, Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem was unthinkable. The city had been divided for nearly 2 decades. The idea of Israel controlling the Temple Mount had no realistic path forward. 1 year later, it happened in 6 days. In 1986, the idea of recreating the vessels of the temple, the menorah, the priestly garments, the anointing oil, with full rabbinical approval and public display, would have seemed like fantasy. Today, those items sit in a building a few steps from the Western Wall. 1 year at a time, one impossibility at a time. The story has been moving in a single direction for over 70 years. Now consider what is sitting on the table right now. Construction blueprints complete, awaiting a permit. Over 300 trained priests, ready for service. a designated high priest, rehearsed and prepared, sacred vessels, garments, oil, instruments, all finished. A new visitors center in Jerusalem, with a scale model of the temple open to the public. Congressional resolutions addressing Temple Mount access in the United States legislature. A U.S. Secretary of Defense who walked the Temple Mount with Temple Institute leadership. Regional diplomatic conversations about reshaping the administration of the most contested site on Earth, and communities from India, Ethiopia, and Southern Africa completing a journey home that Ezekiel described thousands of years ago. None of this proves a timeline. No one knows the day or the hour. That is not the claim being made here. But there is a difference between not knowing the exact moment and being completely unaware that a moment is approaching. Jesus told his disciples to watch, not to predict, not to calculate, but to watch, to pay attention to the world around them and understand the season they were living in. He used the image of a fig tree. When its branches become tender and its leaves begin to appear, you know that summer is near. You do not know the exact date summer arrives, but you know it is coming, and you prepare accordingly. Here is what preparation looks like in this context. It does not look like fear. It does not look like anxiety or retreating from the world. It looks like the kind of clarity that comes when you understand the story you are living inside. When scattered pieces of a picture suddenly arrange themselves into something recognizable, that is what this video has been building toward. Not panic, clarity. The Third Temple preparations are further along than most people realize, not complete in every dimension. The red heifer search continues. Government authorization has not been granted. The Temple Mount remains one of the most politically sensitive locations on Earth, but the direction of movement is unmistakable. 2,000 years of impossibility have. 2,000 years of impossibility have been giving way, one decade at a time, one development at a time. So here is the question this video began with, and it deserves a direct answer. Are the Third Temple preparations complete? Institutionally, ceremonially, and architecturally, the answer is closer to yes than it has ever been in the modern era. The items are made, the people are trained, the plans are drawn. What remains is authorization, political, legal, and in the view of many who have studied this subject deeply, divine. The ancient texts that described Israel's return also described what follows the temple's restoration. They described it with the same specificity they used to describe everything that has already happened. And everything that has already happened came to pass exactly as written, which means the chapters that have not yet unfolded deserve the same serious attention as the ones that already have. History has never looked like this before. The pieces have never been this assembled. The conversation has never been this close to the center of global politics, and the people who have been preparing for this moment have never been this ready. Something is coming. The preparations make that undeniable. What it means for the days directly ahead, that is a question this generation may not have to wait very long to answer.